Well, thank you very much for that kind word of introduction. I'm very pleased to be able to join you this morning to bring some input into the discussions on a matter that is now occupying almost all my time. As it was mentioned, after my retiring from the World Council of Churches, I was asked and I accepted to be a special envoy for the Ecumenical community. The World Council of Churches, the All Africa Conference of Churches, and the Sudan Council of Churches approached me, and I had to leave whatever else I was doing in order to participate in this process. Therefore, I bring my input based on what I would say is building on a long-term engagement of the ecumenical community and the churches with Sudan. I think more than any other organization, the bodies that I represent have perhaps the longest institutional memory about Sudan. Its sufferings, but also all the efforts that have been made to bring about peace. In 1966, the General Secretary of the World Council of Churches then wrote to the President of Sudan and asked whether they would welcome a delegation to go to Sudan. That was a few years after all the missionaries were expelled from Sudan. Since that time, 1966 to today, I would say that the ecumenical community has engaged the Sudanese at a very deep level. There are a couple of things I want to share about what we have done in the last 6 months since I took up this responsibility. I think the first one is in interpreting the message and the wishes of the churches of Sudan. We have managed to have impact on the whole question of the date of the referendum. When I took up this job, I would say that most of those I met had the idea of the referendum should be postponed. The priority I had was to meet with the IGAD, with the Troika, US, UK, Norway, the Arab League in Cairo, the African Union, and the United Nations. And I think the message that came, because we said no one else in Sudan understands the Sudanese people, no one else in Sudan is trusted so much by the Sudanese people than the churches. So what the churches tell you is bringing the message of the Sudanese people, and therefore you must listen. And the difference we made between the technicalities of a referendum and the fundamental notion of the self-determination of the Sudanese people, I think that is what has carried the day. I would say 6 months later, especially October last month, when we went to the UN, met the Secretary General of the UN, we went to the US, met the government leadership in Washington, D.C. Now they had accepted the referendum must take place on time, because the people of South Sudan will not understand why on so-called technicalities you cannot hold the referendum on time. 9th of January 2011 is a sancrosanct for the people of Southern Sudan. That's the message that we have put across, and I think that has sunk well. So I'm happy to say that I think as we look at it now, the referendum for Southern Sudan will take place on 9th of January. And I have no doubt in my mind they will vote almost to the person for separation. Because, and Dr. Dow has explained clearly, unity has not been made attractive. But also, very fundamentally, there's no way, as one time John Garang said, if you have people, if you give people an opportunity to choose between becoming free, having their dignity affirmed, and their human rights respected, a choice between that and a vote to be second-class citizen, what should any person who has a conscience will vote, I think, for the right thing, and that would be to separate. Today, we are witnessing the most defining moment for Sudan. The voter registration that started on Monday culminates this defining moment. And I think it's so historic that we meet here at this time. Because I think the eyes of the world are focusing on Sudan today. And there's no other agenda, there's no other date that is being discussed in the world so much as 9th of January 2011. There's no other locality that is so much on the mind of the international community than Southern Sudan. But having said that, there are several hot spots that I want to mention that we need to pay attention for. One is Abyei. As you know, Abyei was also supposed to have a referendum on 9th of January. Now, as we know, this is not going to happen because the decision that was made on Sunday in Khartoum was to deal with the Abyei problem outside of the CPA. As churches, we have argued very, very firmly that if you begin negotiations outside of the CPA framework, then you endanger, you jeopardize the CPA. And that is very dangerous. But now the decision was made that Abyei issue be resolved by the presidency. That is a meeting between al-Bashir and Salva Kiir, which will take place after al-Bashir comes from Mecca next week. And what I understand will happen after I have talked last week with the leadership of Southern Sudan government is that the president of Sudan will be asked through a decree to cede Abyei to the south, but with a number of conditions. Compromises are being called for. That's what even Hillary Clinton yesterday at the UN said both sides should compromise. Our message as churches is that the Southern Sudanese have compromised too much. The CPA itself is a compromising document. So how much more compromise do you want it to be made? So we are saying that one of the hot spots is Abyei. And if Abyei is going to be resolved that way, then the people of Abyei will have been denied the right and the role of making decisions themselves. The other hot spots, apart from what Dr. Dow mentioned, is the Southern Kordofan and Blue Nile. These were denied the right of self-determination. They were given the so-called popular consultations. The people of these states argued that their aspirations cannot be represented by people who are elected in a flawed elections, most of whom for Blue Nile, which is the only that had the election, are members of NCP. So that's another hot spot that we must take into account. Because even if the South were to go and the referendum were to be peaceful, it is quite possible that violence will flare out in these regions, and then, of course, it will have implications for the South. Darfur has been mentioned. That's another hot spot, which we must take into account. And then there is also issue of security and rights of Southerners living in the North. Dr. Dow did mention already what the Minister of Information said a couple of weeks ago, that if the South do vote to secede, then they will have no rights. But at least there is one encouragement. On Sunday, one of the positive decisions that were made was about citizenship, which is one of the post-referendum issues. It was agreed that until July of next year, all Sudanese will have right to citizenship wherever they are. And therefore, that will help the parties concerned to negotiate about the final citizenship issue. So this, I think, has been very helpful, and we look forward to that. I think it's important for us to focus on the voter registration that was mentioned, because once al-Bashir through the pressure from the international community, agreed that the referendum has to take place, cannot be postponed. What they're trying now is to rig the voter registration process and the referendum itself in such a way that it will not achieve the 60% turnout threshold. Because if they defeat that through registration of ghost voters, because we suspect that is what is going to happen, you have so many millions of ghost voters registered who will not come to vote, and therefore the 60% turnout threshold will not be reached. That is the biggest danger we have. And therefore, I think the international community has the responsibility to put pressure and also to monitor very closely and do the observation in a way that it will be made impossible for such a rigging of the elections to take place. Finally, I want to say that as churches, our contribution to peace and the civic education is perhaps the most that we can do. Dr. Dow mentioned about a very important meeting that took place. In the run-up to the CPA, the Sudanese churches, with the support of AACC and the World Council of Churches, started the people-to-people peace dialogue. That has continued. The last of that meeting took place a couple of weeks ago. I think it's through this that we have seen some semblance of peace. One of the areas that we're involved in a lot is inter-ethnic conflicts. And the meeting in Jonglei that took place in September helped. And we are going to have on the 27th of November, the Sudan Council of Churches will organize a meeting between the Ngong, Dinka, and the Misireya, which is perhaps, for Abe, as I said, is the biggest hot spot. And therefore, it's within the framework of this peace, particularly between the communities and avoiding the clash between the troops of the North and the South. And we are appealing very strongly to the United Nations. I know that our appeal, although we made it, we were assured by the Secretary General last 3 weeks ago when we met him, that yes, the UN will increase the troops. But they have decided not to have a buffer zone. If you have no buffer zone at the border, where there are only 5 kilometers between the troops, it is quite possible that a slight provocation could lead to an open war. And that is what must be avoided at all costs. And therefore, putting pressure on the UN and all those involved, I think is important. What I would say that as churches we want to emphasize again and again is that war should not be an option for Southern Sudan. Because if the war breaks out again, I would say that not only Southern Sudan, not only the Eastern Africa, but I think the whole of Africa and certainly the world security will also not be guaranteed. Thank you very much.